Fantastic. Well, this is always the awkward part when people are coming in. But, hello, everyone. Glad that you're here with us today. And it is time for another webinar with Citrus Labs. And thank you so much for tuning in today. As always, my name is Susanne. I am the co-founder and CEO of Citrus Labs, and I am joined today by Dr. Swathi Varanasi, one of our principal investigators at Citrus Labs. And we're excited to talk about your reality check and why 100% results in your clinical study aren't realistic. And content-wise, we'll first talk about what clinical trials are, then talk about challenges and misconceptions we often face in research and specifically when working with brands, and then dive into some actionable advice on what brands can do to meet expectations. And before we start with the content, please put any questions you have into the Q&A box or in the chat. Well, Dr. Swathi, I am thrilled to talk to you today. Before we get into today's topic, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do here at Citrus Labs?
Yes, definitely. So by trade, I'm a pharmacist, but very early on, growing up in my household, we used Ayurvedic formulations just as often as we used over-the-counter formulations and prescriptions. And so, from a very young age, looking at healthcare as an opportunity or a career path, I always saw healing, health, and wellness as a very multifaceted, multi-pronged approach. And as I went through my schooling, was, looking for the right mentors to pursue this, unconventional path. And along the way, I fell in love with clinical research. I think it's so important, especially in the supplement over-the-counter space, to really help consumers understand how products are working, well, first and foremost, if they're working, and then how they're working. And so I'm all about, how we can improve clinical trials and studies so that consumers can learn as much as they possibly can about how to make the right decisions for their healing, health, and wellness, and how they can optimize certain parts of their life. So that's a little bit of my, background and kind of philosophy. I've spent my career across everything from patient care, whether that's in the clinic, pharmacy, or hospital setting. And then I worked in academia and CPG, health, food, and wellness, and also worked, of course, in clinical research and in biotech. So I'm happy to be here. Yes.
We are happy that you are here with us. And let's start at the beginning. So one thing, that we are often getting asked is, what is actually a clinical study? And also, what is the difference, between a clinical study and then a perception study?
Yes. So let's start with the consumer perception or perception study. So first and foremost, a consumer perception study, unlike some things in science, consumer perception studies is super well named. It's like exactly what it sounds like. So it's exactly perceiving how the consumer feels or how they experience the product. And so generally that's through, non-validated questionnaires. So these are questions. So the difference between, non-validated and validated is, validated questionnaires that are oftentimes used in clinical trials. They have been, put through rigorous testing. They've been used in a lot of other studies with certain patient populations, and they've therefore demonstrated that they can provide objective data that we can draw information from. Whereas in consumer perception studies, we use non-validated questionnaires, so that yields subjective data. That's still very valuable information because that helps the brand, and it helps also the consumer really understand how people are using the product, what sorts of benefits are they feeling. And so non-validated really just means, what are the main questions that the brand has that they want to ask a consumer, so they can get that information to then maybe iterate and create a 2.0 product, or maybe it's to sell that product in and of itself through research-backed marketing claims. And then also in consumer perception studies, there's generally only one study group. And so one study group generally means that, it's open label. So everyone in the cohort or in the study knows exactly what brand the product is coming from and what specific product it is. And they're all testing it at the same time for the same study duration. And then also in perception studies, there generally isn't any sort of, like statistical analysis. It's more of evaluating those answers to the non-validated questionnaires. I still think consumer perception studies are incredible. They're great for brands to figure out if a product is, being perceived as having certain benefits by their consumers or their intended, customer population. And, therefore they can make marketing claims that are actually based in data. So that's first and foremost, really what a consumer perception study is. And then if we hop to, what a clinical trial is, the difference there being, there can be a lot of different study designs. So there could be everything from, 1 or 2 groups. There could be, something called a crossover study where, there isn't the intervention product and there's, perhaps a placebo or a head-to-head, like another product that does something similar already on the market. And both groups try both products at different times. So the clinical trials in terms of study design can be more complex, and they generally are, larger than simply one group. And, as I mentioned, the non-validated questionnaires with perception studies, clinical trials use validated questionnaires. So again, they've gone through rigorous testing through other previous studies that have, therefore validated their use in certain, symptoms or conditions. And they also can use biomarkers, which is really interesting. So biomarkers really is just a fancy term for, quantitative measures that we get either from, trackers like a Fitbit or an Oura Ring. So they can track anything from like sleep to exercise, heart rate variability, weight changes, and different things like that. There's also studies that we've done at Citrus Labs that involve fecal samples or stool samples. There's also different ways to evaluate how skin changes over a study with the integration of a dermatologist or another healthcare provider, so they can be a part of the evaluation of these different validated questionnaires and or biomarkers. And then something you might have heard of you as in people who are listening, is that there's also placebo-controlled. And so if you see something called placebo-controlled, that's not a perception study, that falls within the realm of a clinical trial. And so that means placebo means exactly what it sounds, right? So placebo is, it looks very similar, ideally exactly the same as the test product, but there is no active ingredient. And so people are really able to test when you're trying the intervention product and the placebo product, you're really able to test what is the intervention product doing versus the placebo, or rather, no active ingredient. The other thing with clinical trial that you may or may not have seen before is the term blinding. And so that really, again, prevents bias or tries to prevent as much bias as possible in the clinical study. So blinding means that, the participant themselves may not know, exactly what brand or exactly what product they're getting. The study, research coordinators might not know either. So they're randomizing it. That's another term that's very much associated with some types of clinical trials, is the idea of randomization. So everyone that is pre-screened and is allowed to be in the study, that's eligible, they are randomized by a computer program, to be in one group or the other. So that randomization, the blinding, placebo, all of that is really associated with a clinical trial. And then, in contrast to a perception study that's really evaluating, the perceived benefits by the consumer, the clinical trials are actually really looking at the safety and efficacy or the effectiveness of the product. And then therefore we can make more quantitative research claims that are backed by statistical analyses. So these claims are then what are, the research team, what we deem as statistically significant. So we're able to report that and make sure that all of it is, compliant with FDA and FTC regulations.
And one thing that I want to add is that there's nothing wrong with perception studies, right? Perception studies are still a good way to get you claims, but you should be transparent about it. You shouldn't say that you conducted a clinical study while in reality you actually conducted a perception study.
Yes, exactly.
And I often also have the feeling that single group studies are kind of demonized and kind of shrugged off as not good science. And on a personal level, I believe that this is wrong. And we could probably do a separate webinar about this. But let's just conclude that, as Swathi mentioned, there are different study designs, and there is no reason why these different study designs, there is a reason why they exist, right? And there's no reason why an RCT, is better than a single group study, because for some, it's not the matter of, am I conducting an RCT or a single group study? It's more of, am I conducting a clinical study versus no clinical study? What is my budget, right? And then the question is, well, it's either an RCT or no study. And in my opinion, it definitely is better to do a single group study versus no study.
Yes.
Okay, so let's assume we have a women's health supplement and conducted a study with Citrus Labs. And Swathi, what are some key variables that can impact the final results of a study?
Yeah, so even before the study begins, some of the, it says after the study on the slide, but really, it's even before the study begins, it's really thinking about, when we're putting the protocol together, what is the power analysis that we need to do from a research standpoint to ensure that we get the right amount of study participants? Because when we get the right amount of study participants, then we can do the correct, effective study statistical analysis. And then that will yield, statistically significant information that then we can turn into marketing claims for a brand. And so the power analysis is first and foremost really important, key variable even before the study begins. Mm-hmm. And then, as we're going through the study protocol, really thinking about what is the inclusion-exclusion criteria and making that really strong, really concrete, because then we can ensure exactly the patient population that makes sense for this intervention product. So if it's a women's health study, then we want, people that identify as female to be a part of the study, and we would therefore exclude people who are male identifying. And then also we want to ensure, that we're not recruiting people within the inclusion criteria, anyone who has a diagnosed condition that could be associated with the product, because we're really looking to optimize someone's health and wellness with a supplement or an over-the-counter product, rather than try to treat or cure them, which is really the, quote unquote, responsibility of the FDA approved, FDA indicated formulations that are prescriptions or medical devices for that matter on the market. Okay, and then, as we go through the study, also what's really important is participant safety. So we're thinking about, whether it's through the study and even before the study begins, there's an authoritative body called the Institutional Review Board. And so every single clinical trial that we do at Citrus Labs that is done in any, organization is submitted to an institutional review board. They are a third-party set of reviewers that go through every single detail of the protocol to ensure that patient safety is first and foremost. And so if we're able to ensure patient safety, both before the protocol and the study even starts and throughout the study, then we can ensure that, the results are, extrapolatable, if that's even a word, and that we can actually use them for creating, claims, and to really think about what does this statistical significance mean in the context of, ensuring patient safety. So all of those things are, really important. And, in the context of, the information being, able to be extrapolated or applied to greater populations, it's important to, create a protocol that can allow that. And so again, this is a lot of it is, even before the study starts, but it's also seeing the protocol through to the end that really sets the stage for what sort of results and, what's really important in the study. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, we want to ensure that every clinical trial is up to the guidance and the standards of the FDA and FTC. Because, one of the biggest misconceptions that I hear as an integrative pharmacist. I work often with clinicians, just as often as I do with patients. And so many people think that, supplements and over-the-counters are not regulated by the FDA. The difference is that instead of, the term regulation, there's oversight from the FDA. They do have a level of involvement. So love to squash that misconception here now, is that the FDA is involved, just not to the same, level as they are involved in, let's say, a prescription medication. And the main authoritative body apart from the FDA is the FTC. And so they're involved in a lot of the, regulation and standardization for, everything that goes on within the over-the-counter and supplement space.
Yeah, I think the part that the FDA does, right, is that GRAS list that generally recognized as safe, and then they tell you, in what dosages this ingredient is typically safe. And Swathi, you also mentioned one thing, powering, the power of a study. I think, when people think about power, right, they mostly think about underpowering, which means, not measuring an effect when there is one due to, for example, sample size issues, too small of a sample size. But there's also a thing like overpowering, where you have too many participants. And the issue with overpowering is that you get statistically significant results that actually don't mean anything.
Exactly. Yes.
So, a good example is, for example, HbA1c, right? Your blood sugar, basically. And, when that goes from 10.2 to 10, for example, then if the study is overpowered, you would get a statistically significant result, but in reality, it doesn't mean anything.
Yes, exactly. That's a great example.
And from what you've seen in your work, what do you think are like the key challenges in clinical trials, specifically in the health and wellness space?
Oh boy. I mean, this could be a whole nother webinar. So, I mean, I would say one of the things is kind of the nebulous regulatory landscape that I kind of just alluded to before, with the FDA's involvement and their oversight, as well as the FTC involvement. And so, with that, it's really important to, tread lightly when it comes to, what sorts of claims brands want to make and what sorts of claims are really appropriate in the eyes of the FDA and the FTC. And so that's why it's so important, something I said briefly earlier, but it's really important to think about with recruitment, with inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria, that we are targeting populations that are looking to improve or optimize their health, but are not necessarily looking for something that's going to cure or treat them. And so that is, always been a, point of contention of doing studies in the health and wellness space, is that, these products within the health and wellness space are really there to improve us, not to necessarily change us, if that makes sense. So I think that's one of the biggest things too, is that looking at parameters that are still very much evidence-based, that are still very quantitative, like validated tools looking at quality of life and different things like that. There's still so much value to that, but I think that sometimes certain entities or clinicians maybe overlook some of the quantitative analysis that comes out of health and wellness trials, because that's not as rigorous. It's but I wouldn't agree. I think the quality of life improvement in someone is really important, particularly if it's statistically significant and all of the analyses was done appropriately. So I think some of the having the willingness to have a little bit of pushback on some of the, maybe perceptions that come from the conventional space is important, but also just trying to fit each product into, the regulatory landscape that exists right now, with trying to make claims in the space.
Yeah, that's a great, keyword, regulatory landscape. I think there's a lot of confusion still, even though it shouldn't be, but I think the FTC guidelines that were published in December last year, 2022, while they probably meant well, it really caused confusion. And what we see is that, we have a lot of lawyers involved now, and lawyers are participating in study design. And that does not, no offense to anybody, but that does not necessarily help research.
Yeah.
So that's definitely, I think, a big challenge that we currently see in health and wellness. And, in the same, like with the same thought, you already talked about, misconceptions, pushback, right? Results being deemed as, not rigorous because it's just quality of life. What do you think are like the biggest misconceptions about clinical trial outcomes?
I think that, from a brand perspective and even from a, clinician perspective, I think everyone assumes that it's going to be like it only is significant to, them or to the consumer if it's 100%. And that's a little bit about, what the title of today's webinar is really about, is that reality check, is that, like, especially, speaking to a lot of brands and stuff that, that brands that are doing clinical trials, is like they expect, 95, 98, 100%. And they think that it's almost a failure on their part as a brand, that maybe they didn't do something right, or maybe their product could be better. But in reality, like, we shouldn't be aiming for 100% because there's so many factors at play. And it's really one of the most important things that we try to articulate when working with brands, is like, this is not your fault. This is a clinical study. And so the expectation is, a certain threshold of percentage that, we deem as statistically significant, but we're not expecting, and therefore you should also not expect a, 100% across the board in 15 parameters, or, a 95% average or something like that.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that, product doesn't work or doesn't have an impact, right? And one thing that I just want to mention very briefly, sneak peek, this week we are launching or releasing a consumer report, and we interviewed over 1,000 individuals, consumers, users of health and wellness products, and ask them about claims and what they feel about claims when they see, claims in the high 90s or 100% claims. And almost everybody did not trust these results. What I found extremely interesting is that consumers have even a positive association with claims that are 50%. The result from these interviews was that when they see 50%, they feel that the brand is honest, the product worked for every other person, and this is enough for them to just try it out because it might as well work for them. And this is something that I believe many brands are actually not aware of. And I think the highest association, positive association we saw was with claims in the 70%. And typically this is something that brands would say, oh, these are not good results, right?
Definitely. I mean, from a, being a patient myself, being a consumer myself, I mean, I would agree, seeing so many 90s in a row on a brand's website, I would wonder, maybe, who was involved in the study? Was it a skewed subject sample, or, I would start asking questions like that as well. So that's very interesting that across, over 1,000 people, that really is the agreed upon perception. That's very interesting.
Yeah. And what do you think, should brands do with data that actually doesn't meet their expectations?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, when brands have, so when brands are doing studies, right, they have these certain expectations set in their mind of exactly, what they want to do, how they want to use the material. I think it's really important to have an open and honest conversation with the research team who, helped compute some of the analyses. And also, and as you, mentioned briefly as well, like with the legal team. So you can go through the results and see exactly like what you're thinking of saying, but what is scientifically sound from an objective standpoint. point, but also what is legally sound, so that you can make sure that, all your I's are dotted and T's are crossed, and, then everyone can kind of be in alignment. So I feel like first and foremost, that's, to me, like the most important thing.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think it again also comes down to transparency.
Yes.
And I know that I sound like a broken record, but I found it really surprising how clinical studies are treated like a big secret for many brands. Brands went the extra mile. They have research. They should be proud of it. And, tell consumers more about their research, create a dedicated clinical trial subpage on their website and really brag about the study. And this is something, I'm not sure why some brands that actually have really good research just don't do it. So that makes me very sad. Not only, when they don't publish stuff from us, but I know that, some brands that I like and admire, they have done awesome research in the past years and they just don't talk about it. So this is for me, really mind blowing. But I think it's also, expectations and expectation management that is often driven by marketing. And, how do you think can actually marketing professionals really set realistic expectations also when promoting products based on clinical trial outcomes?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that, really understanding, from the consumer report that's coming out this week too, that, really understanding what consumers are going to resonate with. I think sometimes there's a disconnect between what marketing teams want to say versus what the consumer wants to see. So I think that, like, dealing with that disconnect and kind of moving forward from that, I think, is really important. And I think also part of expectation setting, at least from my standpoint, is figuring out exactly where the brand lies within the market. I think that's so important, because if you are a skincare brand, let's say, what are you specialized in? Like, what are your exact goals for, yes, you want to make marketing claims on XYZ things, but as a brand, I feel like this comes back even like before getting science involved. It's like a brand decision, discussion, messaging of where does my brand fit, and actually like asking, the internal, senior management team, what do we want to help our consumers with? And then I think that level of specificity also really helps going into, a study design and going into a set of marketing claims that, a team might want to make, if they really figure out exactly what they want to say and how they want to differentiate themselves. Because being science-backed is incredible, and I love to see more and more brands do that. But, it's not only being science-backed, it's also figuring out exactly what you want to provide as like a service to your consumer, your customer.
And this is great because I often have the feeling that brands actually don't know that. And brands also don't know what makes them special and also what makes their product special. I feel like often even the claims they want to make, they are all over the place. And I think, just thinking about, research, you mentioned, that this should tie into study design and making claims. I think it should also go into, really coming up with that one research question. What do you actually want to find out? What are your, objectives of the study? It can't be 20 different things, you have to choose.
Exactly. And I think narrowing in there is where brands are maybe missing the mark, and maybe at the end they realize, oh, maybe I should have focused on, these few versus, the whole like range of 20. Because I mean, I think that's kind of key in creating a brand, is like, what do you want your brand to say? What do you want these products to do? And I feel like if brands started from more of that perspective, it would help, the clinical trial process, and it would help the results that they get to be more applicable.
Absolutely. And then, once you specialize and once you know what you want to find out, you can design a study in a way that it actually meets also your expectations, and not, I have 20 different parameters that I want to test. like sticking with skincare, right? From hydration to wrinkles to texture, to, it's also, acne friendly. It's very unlikely that, as you mentioned before, right, Swathi, that you score high 90s, 100% in all of those.
Exactly. So it's like thinking about what ingredients you're selecting, what's the research to back these ingredients that you're using, and then therefore, that could provide maybe some direction and, figuring out where you fit in the market. Maybe there is a huge space for a really hydrating product, and that's just, missing in the, hyperpigmentation space. And maybe those are the two parts that you really hone in on. I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud, but I think that there's a lot of potential white space even in the skincare market, even though there seem to be a bajillion brands out there. I think that if brands go in with a bit more specificity on what they want to do, I think it would help everything.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And obviously, Swathi, you're a researcher, but you also do a lot of work in the CPG space. Mm-hmm. What advice would you give to brands preparing for their first clinical study?
Yeah, I mean, very similar to what we were talking about before, is like, what do you want to help your consumers with? Like, what is your top, in creating a brand and in the vision, the mission, all the things, like, what are the top 3 things that you want every consumer to walk away feeling after using the product? Or what sorts of benefits do you want them to have? And that can really inform how we at Citrus Labs as a research team can think about the correct study design that can really help you get the results you're looking for to market to that specific population. So that's mainly, what I would say is, what are you looking to achieve? And then how can a clinical study fit into the, paradigm of what you're trying to achieve? Because once a brand is more clear on that, then we're happy to come in and say, from a scientific perspective, this is what we would do now that you've given us these parameters.
I love it. Okay. So in this short amount of time, we learned about clinical trials, what clinical trials are, why brands don't need claims in their high 90s and 100% in order to claim that their study actually was successful. And we also talked a little bit about a shift in consumer expectations when it comes to clinical trials. And I think now it's a good time for your questions, and please use the Q&A box or use the chat function on Zoom. And while you type your questions, I quickly want to let you know about our next webinar, which will happen already in 2 weeks on November 30th. This time, not only with 1, but 2 lawyers. And we are talking FTC, FDA. We're also talking claims, the right substantiation to make those claims. What happened with MOGRA? And any new and exciting developments regarding the FTC guidelines for the supplement health claims. And if you are thinking about conducting your own clinical study, reach out to us. We're happy to talk. Just send an email to hello@citruslabs.com. That's again hello@citruslabs.com, or visit our website www.citruslabs.com and fill out our contact form, and a member of our team will be in touch. Okay, so let's see.
So Susanne, I have a question I think might be helpful to clarify for brands.
Yeah.
At the end of the study, when they get all of their results, they get all this data and they're sending it over to their marketing team. They're trying to figure out, what exactly do I share with my audience? How do I make this data relatable to them? And so what we often suggest to brands is to create a science subpage. So could you elaborate on what kind of data should be included on that subpage and what kind of format that should be presented in?
That is a really great question. So I think for this subpage, I think it's important to be extremely transparent, and to do that, you should basically talk more about what kind of study design was used, being very transparent, and the more transparent you are, the less you will also likely get in trouble with the FDA and FTC, because all they care about is that you are transparent and that, you know, consumers know what you did and what's going on, right? I think it would also be good to include what data you collected in terms of methodologies. So what, you know, Swathi talked about, was it, you know, study-specific questionnaires, validated questionnaires? Did you include biomarkers? If yes, which ones? Was it, you know, digital markers like a Fitbit, for example, or Oura, or was it, you know, scales to measure weight or blood pressure, cough? Did you involve skin swabs for skin microbiome testing, scalp swabs, stool samples, for example, or, you know, standard blood draws? And then I think it's also important to talk about who conducted the study, you know, because a lot of brands, they use their in-house research team, and I'm not obviously, you know, it still should be, you know, unbiased, but if you use your in-house research team versus an external research team, I think an external research team has a little bit more credibility versus your in-house researchers. So I think this is also very important. And then obviously, if you have more to show apart from 1 or 2 or 3 studies that you have done, and you also want to showcase existing research in the space you are in, then this is also, you know, the right place to showcase, you know, studies that, you know, basically also substantiate your claims. Anything to add, Swathi?
Yeah, I would agree with all of that from like a content perspective. Oh, sorry. I don't know if you can hear that. I just dropped my pencil. So, you know, I would agree with all of that from a content perspective, but I would also add like the way in which it is just illustrated, I think is really important. So, you know, you can have all of that information, but if there aren't, you know, like colorful graphs or maybe infographics or something, then I think it's hard to capture the attention of, you know, the viewer or the reader who might already be interested in clinical research and in the research backed, you know, claims and all of that good stuff associated with the brand. I think it's also important, like what it looks like. And I can think of, you know, a few brands that, you know, we've worked with at Citrus Labs that do such a good job of, you know, being very objective, showing with transparency exactly, you know, what was done in the study. And then also, you know, creating really nice graphs and infographics that then they've repurposed on social media. They've repurposed it in, you know, their email newsletter, different places like that. And so I think that's a key part of it too, is like being objective, but then how it looks, I think is just important from a consumer perspective.
Yeah, I think so too. And don't just, you know, put that on your website next to your product, right? That's what I think most brands are doing, but be proud of it. And what Swathi mentioned, right? Put it on your social, put it on your ads, put it, you know, in your email newsletters. All right. Any other questions? There's a countdown. And the countdown is now over. Okay, well, again, thank you so much for joining us today. And again, our next webinar is on November 30th with Heather Bustos and Carrie Tassopoulos, in which we'll talk about product claims, how to substantiate claims, and FTC and FDA updates. Well, thanks again for listening in, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye.
Bye.